Now for our third plenary talk. This is, and by the way, thank you very much for your talk and also for the broad perspective that your unit is taking in it. I think it's very refreshing to all of us to see that space as well. And now our final plenary speaker for today is Tomcats Elias, who he's recently moved from being Dean of Engineering at Duke to Provost at University of Virginia. He is one of the founding members of the NAE's Grand Challenge Scholars Program, as a matter of fact, and he helped organize the first NAE Grand Challenge Summit that was held in Durham in 2009. He has been involved with organizing regional, national, and now global summits right from the beginning, and most recently in Beijing, as a matter of fact. And he's helped propel the challenges to national and now international prominence and engagement. So I'm really happy that Tom has come here, going to talk about the Grand Challenge Scholars Program and its national and global growth. Tom, thank you very much.
Thank you, Dan. Appreciate it. Well, good afternoon. It's an honor to follow these outstanding speakers. If anybody would like a seventh inning stretch, you want to just take 30 seconds, I'm going to have a drink of water. Please stand up and stretch your legs. Well, this is a session about response to the grand challenges. And it's my honor and pleasure to tell you about the response of the higher education community to the grand challenges. And I have... So to give a little history, this effort really began with the NAE Grand Challenges Summit in 2009. I'd like to acknowledge my close partners, Yanis Yortsos and Rick Miller, throughout this process. A number of us responded to the Grand Challenges not as a list, but as a call to action. A call not just to address the grand challenges themselves, but to address the implications they had for educating the next generation of engineers who would address them. And if you saw the first slide where I showed those young children, that's to remind us, you know, whose grand challenges these are. These are the grand challenges for the 21st century. So our goals when we started out were to create a generation and a community of engineers with the skill set and mindset to solve grand challenges. And if you will allow me to refer to my Greek heritage, we were inspired by the 300 of ancient Sparta. And we thought about what a small number of specially prepared and motivated soldiers did to change the course of a civilization. And we imagined what impact several thousand specially prepared and motivated engineers could have on the course of our civilization. We also thought that this would be a powerful framing of engineering to attract a diverse set of students to engineering and to retain them, and to incent students to stretch themselves beyond the basic engineering curriculum, and to integrate co-curricular and curricular education into a whole that was greater than the sum of its parts. So that's what we started off on. Before I tell you what the Grand Challenge Scholars Program is, it's helpful to reflect a little bit on how the engineering profession has changed over the last 100 years. So to help me do this, we start by looking back at the great achievements of the 20th century to see how they differ from the grand challenges of the 21st. And if you look at items 2, 3, 4, and 5 here, this is it's automobile, airplane, and water distribution. So I call this one planes, drains, and automobiles. And it really is a list of amazing engineering devices. But if you look at the 21st century list, things like making solar energy economical, providing clean water to 1 billion people who lack regular access to it, and so on, it has a quite different flavor. Instead of being about devices, these are largely complex societal issues with a technology component. But almost none of them can be solved with the technology alone. And that sort of gives us a guidance of where to go with preparing engineers for grand challenges. And I think Dawn set it up nicely when she talked about solving the problem of cybersecurity. You can come up with a solution with 5 extra digits that gives you absolute security, but if people won't use it, then it's not a solution. So you have to understand the behavior, and that's the extra dimension. When you look at make solar energy economical, it's that extra word in the way the framers, many of whom will be here tomorrow morning, I'm looking forward to that panel, the way they framed this, if they just said make solar energy, then it's a physics problem of turning photons to electrons. But that one extra word means that an engineer must understand the implications for business, for human behavior, for policy in order for this solution to be viable. So the broader implications of the grand challenges, as you notice, they're increasingly interdisciplinary compared to the 20th century challenges. They don't fit within any one discipline or even within engineering. They describe engineering in human-facing terms. They're about making the world more sustainable, more healthful, more secure, and more joyful. And they are indeed a powerful tool for changing the conversation, as the NRC report once said. Now, this changing of the conversation or the reframing of what engineering is about, I think is nicely reflected in this short video from a Grand Challenge Scholars student. As you watch it, notice how it starts with a 20th century description of what engineering is and evolves to more of a 21st century description about helping people and then comes back. So if you can play this video, please.
I'm an engineer. Whenever someone asks me what an engineer does, I respond, I build things. Engineers make all sorts of things, from the houses we live in and the places we work, to the cars we drive and the roads we drive on. It always starts with an idea, and so when we're faced with grand challenges, we need big ideas. With a population now over 7 billion stretching the resources of our planet ever further, we need to turn these big ideas into reality. And that's where engineers come in. We build things.
So it's a reframing that evolves from about building things to about helping people. And if you recall Dan Mote's comments this morning about the challenge of communicating with the public, this slide really goes to that. So in 2009, when we organized the Grand Challenge Summit in Durham, we commissioned Peter Hart and Associates to do a survey of public opinion about engineering. And they posed the question to the public this way. They said, do you think the issues and problems of engineering are more interesting and important than those of medicine, business, and law? And 40% of the public responded by saying, yes, engineering challenges are more important or much more important than those of business, medicine, and law. Then they read this group 5 of the grand challenges for engineering for the 21st century. And they reposed the question, and the response jumped up to 54%. Now, Peter Hart told me he'd had a long career as a pollster. He said in his history of doing polling, he had never seen such a dramatic shift in response to reading a brief list. And so we realized there was something powerful about this and untapped. And in particular, we noticed that by demographic, those that responded the most, a bigger than 20% jump, were the women and underrepresented minority groups. So this is a very powerful hook for all populations, but particularly there. So what do students need to be able to solve grand challenges? Well, the requirements for solving grand challenges are the same as for implementing any innovation successfully. And I think earlier today, Simon Pitts referred to a metaphor of a T-shaped individual. And I like to extend that metaphor from T-shaped to I-shaped. And we use the metaphor of an I-beam with 3 pieces. The main piece down the middle is feasibility, and that's the engineering fundamentals. But the top piece is viability. That's understanding the business aspects of realizing this innovation. And the bottom piece is desirability. That is, do people want it as individuals or collectively as society? So any solution to a grand challenge or any innovation must be at the same time feasible, viable, and desirable. And I have a couple of stories just to illustrate this and drive it home, both from the early days of Engineers Without Borders. And they shared with me these 2 stories. One, there was an early project in Africa to bring water to an underserved village. And they brought pumps from the US, they implemented the pumps, everything worked perfectly, but there were no spare replacement parts. There was no mechanism in place or business model in place for paying for replacement parts. And within a year when they went back, most of the pumps and wells had failed. And so it was feasible and it was desirable, but there was no viable business model for sustaining it. The second example is from Engineers Without Borders. In early stages, they went down to a village in Central America, and they noted that the women were carrying jugs on their heads down to a river to fill with water. And so the students decided that they would build a well. And they did a geotechnical survey and everything was perfect. They built the well worked perfectly, and it was never used. And why is that? It turns out that the trip down to the river was the one time during the day where the women were able to get away from the men and socialize. And they didn't want to use the well. So it never got used. So there's an example. It was feasible, it was viable, but it was not desirable. You need all three pieces. Okay. So that brings us to what is the Grand Challenge Scholars Program, and this is what we came up with. It is, in addition to a rigorous engineering education in engineering fundamentals, 5 additional pieces. The first is a project or research activity engaging a grand challenge. The second is an interdisciplinary curriculum, particularly one that brings in understanding of behavior, business, and policy. The third piece is an entrepreneurship experience. The rationale here is if you think about a grand challenge like provide clean water to 1 billion people, there are not enough Melinda Gateses in the world for it to scale to that, so you need a model that if it's not for profit, at least it has to be for break even in order to scale to that grand size. The fourth thing is a global dimension because these grand challenges don't respect geographic boundaries. And lastly is a service learning piece to develop social consciousness, but also to have authentic experiences with real clients mentored by professional engineers or faculty. So those were the components, and if a student completed those 5 things to the satisfaction of a faculty committee at the home institution, then they would receive a designation from the NAE and a nice letter hand signed by Dan Moat saying that they were an NAE Grand Challenge Scholar. So let me give you a couple of examples of that. The first one is a revenue-generating public toilet in Togo. There was a student, Connor Cotton, who went to a health clinic in Togo and asked them what it was that they needed most. They found out that the biggest problem there was diarrheal-borne disease because they had open latrines and no sewage system. So they asked for pay toilets. And so it didn't take Connor long to do a little research on experiments with pay toilets at surrounding villages to realize that very poor people would not pay to go to the bathroom at the toilet, even if it was in the greater interest of society. So they had to come up with a different business model, a different plan. And his idea was working with Professor Mark DeSouche at Duke to create a digester that would produce biogas, which could be captured and burned to produce electricity, which could be actually sold for charging cell phones or for other purposes, and that this would sustain the project. And so by the end of his 4th year, they were able to build a 6-seat prototype. Here you see the pipes coming down from the 6 toilets, and they would go to this digester here. Another example I really like is this one with Scott Martin. And I like it because it's a twist on the old story. You know, the one that says if you give a man a fish, he'll eat for a day. If you teach a man to fish, he'll eat for a lifetime. And the punchline here is if you teach a man or a woman to engineer, a whole village can eat for generations to come. And you see here Scott Martin teaching wave mechanics to a group of villagers in how to design their sustainable fishery. This is a grand challenge that ties to reverse engineer the brain. This was the Walk Again project, which culminated at the World Cup in Brazil in 2014. The idea was for the first time to have a paraplegic come out and walk in a public setting and kick out the first ball using a brain-controlled interface to control the exoskeleton. And so this grand challenge, in fact, did take place. And you see the patient kicking out the first ball. The remarkable thing here was the first thing the patient told Miguel after kicking out the ball was, "I felt the ball in my foot." And what had happened there is they had been sensorizing the bottom of the shoe here and feeding the sensor information back to his arm. And so over time, his brain had reprocessed that and began to associate the sense on the arm with coming from his foot. So he began to feel actually the ball being kicked by his foot. So another project in the category of Engineer Better Medicines, a student group under Bob Malkin developed what was called the Pratt Pouch. And this was a solution to a problem of drug delivery because there is a drug cocktail that is very effective at preventing the transmission of HIV from a mother to child, but you have to take the drug the entire 9 months of pregnancy. And the problem is in these tropical climes, the shelf life of the drug, once it's opened and not refrigerated, is a month. So this was not a solution, and of course the other problem was the dosages were inconsistent. So they came up with something which was basically like a ketchup pouch, and they were able to show that this had a 12-month shelf life and gave the right dosages, and it's in use now in Ecuador, Zambia, Tanzania, and Namibia. So what do the students think about the Grand Challenge Scholars Program? This is a quote from Kevin Morrow, who was a Grand Challenge Scholar at Duke. And he was working on brain-to-brain interfaces, including that Walk Again project. And he said, to basically addressing to other students, take advantage of the Grand Challenge Scholars Program if it's offered at your school. It really does give you a great mindset to plan your future. The list is about nothing other than the pursuit of something that will last beyond our lifetimes and trickle down in the history lessons taught to future generations. The 14 National Academy of Engineering Grand Challenges aren't just a call to those already in the field, they're a call to anyone passionate about innovation and the grand impacts it can have on our lives. And here are some images from Grand Challenge scholars around the country doing various activities. This story of the Grand Challenges has been picked up in the media. This is a cover story by ASEE Prism about the program. There was a story in USA Today. And so where are we? We're 6 years out, and now more than 200 students have graduated as Grand Challenge scholars to date. When we look back on it, they're roughly 50% women without any intention of balancing by gender. There are 20 active programs in the United States and 2 international. There's a national steering committee. I want to acknowledge those leaders here. And we have very valuable partnerships with Engineers Without Borders, EPICS, Epicenter, the American Association for Engineering Professional Societies, and there have been a number of workshops and programs on it. Here are the 22 approved programs. You see in red the 2 that are international, Taylor's University of Malaysia and National University of Singapore. And this is in some rough order of where they first began. And the most recent one is Georgia Tech. And what's remarkable about Georgia Tech is the scale at which they do everything. So, most of the schools have pledged to graduate 20 Grand Challenge scholars a year. Georgia Tech has pledged to graduate 150 Grand Challenge scholars per year. So what is the vision of what lies ahead? The idea is if we can have 20 graduates per year from 100 institutions, that's 20,000 Grand Challenge engineers over the next decade. We would form a community of like-minded scholars within 5 years that would have a lifelong network they could tap into throughout their careers. And it would be a step towards transforming engineering higher education and have a halo effect on K-12 and other segments of society. So to that end, the National Academy of Engineering sponsored a workshop on educating engineers to meet grand challenges last April, attended by 100 deans and thought leaders. And out of that workshop came this commitment. We, the undersigned deans, commit to educate a new generation of engineers expressly equipped to meet grand societal challenges. We have affirmed the importance of such aims as a reflection of our core values, as a source of inspiration for drawing a generation to the call of improving the human condition, as a driver for our nation and economy and world economies, and as essential to security, sustainability, health, and joy. And committing to 20 students a year. 122 deans signed that commitment letter. So this is really taken on legs. You can see across the country. And here's a sampling of those signatures. I'm not going to be able to show you them all. But we took that letter to President Obama March 23rd. And I got to tell Chad Holliday, I had my 2 sentences ready for the president. And it wasn't the Pope, but it was the president. And of course, I was so starstruck, I immediately forgot the first one. So. And I'll tell you what it was. This was in the middle of March Madness, and I was going to pass to him a message that Dean Kaye from Duke had wanted me to tell him that Duke is not just an engineering school. So, but I never got that in. Instead, I got somewhat upstaged by the president, who grabbed us and said, you know, you old guys, probably thought in thermodynamics and calculus was fun just on its own, but the young kids these days, they need to know what it's good for before they'll go and study it. So he showed us that he gets it. He understands what's compelling about societal grand challenges and how important they are to drawing people into this field. And this is a nice image of Dan Moat explaining the commitment letter. And then you see up here Michaela Walker from NC State, who was representing the Grand Challenge Scholars. And you might be able to, I don't know, pick out that nose. Anybody? I don't know if you see. I saw him earlier, but that's Dean Kamen and Bill Nye the Science Guy. And it was what's called a clutch in the White House with a handful of people, including a professional football player from the New York Giants. It was a little eclectic. But we had a great conversation. And it generated a lot of momentum. And that momentum is carried over beyond the US borders. So the global movement has really begun. And what's interesting to find is that these are the US NAE Grand Challenges, but the rest of the world is resonating with them. And so there was a session in 2014 at the World Engineering Education Forum on preparing global students for Grand Challenges. And a new commitment letter was drafted. And interestingly, at that session, the program elements were developed for a global program, and they were the same 5 as in the US program, but from a different perspective. The global deans were saying, we need our students to have a global experience with the West because we see the path to the Grand Challenge solutions for our region as being partnerships with the West. So different intent, but the same elements. Another example, in India, 1,000 students have already been engaged in various Grand Challenge activities through an organization called SPEED and their home institutions. These students have participated in workshops or student competitions associated with Grand Challenges. Here's an image from the Beijing summit last month. These are the winners of the student business plan competition on Grand Challenges and their sponsors. So it's really taking off. So where are we? We have 120 deans have come together for an undergraduate education initiative. This is unprecedented. So it tells you something important is happening here. And my request to you is let's make it happen together. And so I wanted to ask of you, members of the NAE, to support and join this movement. And how would you do that? If you're in academia, become an advisor for a Grand Challenge Scholar program or for a Grand Challenge Scholar. If you are in industry, take the Grand Challenges message to the boardroom. Make it part of the mission statement. If you're in a for-profit business, you're providing value to people. And it's likely that that value is in the form of making their lives more sustainable, more secure, more joyful, and more healthful. And maybe I would say, to vamp on what Chad Holliday said this morning about rebranding yourself now that you're a National Academy member, that's part of your brand. But when somebody asks you what kind of engineer you are, rather than saying you're a chemical engineer or electrical engineer or mechanical engineer, consider saying you're the kind of engineer who makes the world more healthful, more secure, more joyful, and more sustainable. Let's do this together. And I just want to end by acknowledging an inspiration for me and several of us who've been working on this for some time, and that is Chuck Vest. He is the original champion of the Grand Challenges for Engineering. And we have named a scholarship for him, and this is a graduate student opportunity. It brings a graduate student from the UK or other part of the world to the US to one of these 10 institutions to do a year of research in the middle of their PhD on a Grand Challenge. and then go back to their home institution. We hope it will become essentially like the Rhodes Scholar of engineering, but in reverse. Rather than going to Oxford, students coming here. And we hope it'll be a lasting legacy to Chuck Vest. So I'm going to end by just thanking Chuck for his inspiration and this quote that he said: "As we think about the challenges ahead, it is important to remember that students are driven by passion, curiosity, engagement, and dreams. Although we cannot know exactly what they should be taught, we can focus on the environment in which they learn and the forces, ideas, inspirations, and empowering situations to which they are exposed." Thank you, Chuck, and thank you, all of you.
Okay. It's very nice.
Thank you.
Very nice talk. Excellent.
We're done.
Well, Tom, thanks very much for giving the Academy members and guests an overview of what's been going on here and how this has been growing in a kind of electric way in its progress.